What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some launch impressions for the Gothic Remake, a ground-up remake of an absolutely classic and I would honestly say historically important RPG that is Gothic. Before we dive into that fully, I am bringing you this right as that game is releasing, I believe, actually. And that is, of course, possible because I received a review key from THQ Nordic, but you've probably also noticed that this is not a full review, and that is because I got this key on Tuesday. Today is Friday. I'm recording this on Thursday. I simply have not had enough time to completely parse my way through this game, as in addition to being a remake of the original, there's a lot of added content here as well, and I've been trying to make sure I'm not missing any of that. And so, as it stands right this second, I would say, roughly halfway through my first playthrough. Once I finish that up, I've got some save scumming and achievement hunting to do, and then that's going to be followed up by a second playthrough, which is actually going to be permadeath, to wrap up one of the, I would say, probably more difficult achievements in the end to ultimately grab. Once I have that done, I will give people the full review, which, I mean, if everything goes super well, it'll be like next week, give or take. But now that we've got that stuff out of the way, let's talk about the game proper. Honestly, impressions-wise, this has been a great experience so far. I love getting to revisit Gothic, which itself was, again, a really crazy good game for how old it was, and I got to it a lot later than most when I reviewed the original series. Now, we're going to go over it, but they've added some content. Yes, we knew that. They've also changed up some of the progression systems in interesting ways. I have a bit to say on the difficulty here in a minute, which people took umbrage with my preview that I did with the preview build a few weeks ago. But more than anything, to me, it really does feel like they took that original game, remade it in a way, obviously, to improve it graphically, but also adjusted systems, added content in a way that still feels authentic to that original vision. And while you're obviously just not going to please everybody, so far this has been a blast. So let's go a little farther and break that down piece by piece. On the technical side of things, I will say I have, including my time with the preview build and the actual review key release build, about 30 or so hours. In that 30 hours, I've crashed twice. The game also stutters a little bit on occasion. This is relatively rare, and I will mention when I turn my recording software on, it causes a bit of a stutter as well. That's not the game's fault, that's just the recording process. Other than that, it has been running pretty well so far. The only other thing I want to mention is that I notice sometimes in conversations between NPCs where your character is not the one actively talking, like two NPCs are having a conversation and you're just kind of waiting for your opportunity to say something. Sometimes the audio between them gets delayed, I guess you could say, and it kind of takes a second for it to wrap around to the next sentence, and it's weird. But issue-wise, that is more or less it. Now, next up, I want to talk a little bit about the difficulty. So, I mentioned in the preview build that I noticed that they added difficulty options here. The original game was just a set experience. The difficulty was what the difficulty was. In that preview build, I mentioned how I was unsure how I felt about the easier difficulty in particular because the original Gothic was a very specific experience that saw you going from weak little baby hero to being a sort of ultimate killing machine by the end of it. And that journey was a really important experience to that game. However, the thing you have to understand about the original Gothic is none of that was player skill really. You had to learn, train, and upgrade your character, and it would literally change how your character swung their basic weapons. You had to level up, get learning points, go to a trainer. The trainer would give you the level ups and perks and things via that, and then by default you would actually start swinging weapons differently, and this would lead into combos and stuff. So it was really all about your character skill. Player skill, I would actually argue Skyrim was more difficult in terms of player skill. However, that is a bit different in the remake here, and I can see now why they added the difficulty options. This was not readily apparent in the small slice that I saw in the preview, where it kind of mimics the original Gothic a little more closely. Having spent more time with the combat system in this game, there is a bigger emphasis on player skill here. It is still something you can definitely overcome with just stats and learning, to the point where you're dealing so much damage, it is irrelevant. But player skill is more important here than it was in the original game. especially when it comes to doing things like parrying, dodging, performing specific combos, that kind of thing, switching over to the bows and stuff, kind of when to do what. So long story short, again, having played more of this, I can now see why they added those difficulty options, and I think I was just wrong in that preview at the end of the day. Now, I will also say at the same time, however, while you are certainly free to do whatever you want difficulty-wise, I personally do not care if you play this game on easy mode. Throughout this channel's entire existence, I have been super pro difficulty option. Do you? I will say, as a bit of a recommendation, both the original Gothic and this remake, I think, benefit from a little bit of player friction, especially right at the beginning, because your character coming to grips with what the colony is, what that power curve looks like, and overcoming it is, to my mind, what Gothic is all about. So I still think the at least intended Gothic difficulty, which is just normal really, is a better experience than playing it on easy, but again, do whatever you want. I think it's probably safe to assume that this will be a not insubstantial amount of people's first time playing Gothic, so let's talk a little bit about what it is about. The setting of Gothic 1 is you being trapped inside a prison colony known as the Valley of Mines. This is on an island known as Corinus, and there is a magic barrier preventing anyone from leaving the mines. This is the result of some magic that went a bit sideways. So the reason this mining valley is important is because the kingdom at large is at war with orcs. They need the magic ore from these mines to make the weapons they need to fight those orcs, and so they turned it into a prison colony. Their idea was to put up this magic barrier around the mine, basically forcing them to mine for supplies. When that barrier was getting set up, things went sideways due to some sort of interference, and the barrier wound up being much larger than was anticipated. And so the overall situation is pretty straightforward. Inside this now quite large prison colony, there are 3 camps, all of which are mining ore in some form or another, and they trade that ore to the outside world because physical objects can pass through the barrier just fine, just not living things, for the supplies they need in order to survive. That way the kingdom gets their ore that they need, and the people in the colony get the supplies they need. Now this has, unsurprisingly, turned into a bit of a fractious situation, and you may well be wondering, why did this magic go sideways? Well, the subject of that is the broader plot. You, the nameless hero, which is your official name, and you are a set character here. There is no character creation. The original Gothic was the same way. Would have been weird to change it, honestly. But the nameless hero gets thrown into the prison colony. When you go to be dumped into the prison colony, you are given a message by one of the fire mages who wants you to contact the other fire mages inside the colony and pass along this message. Upon getting dumped in right after this, you get a, I would say, quite brutal introduction to how life in the colony is, which is that everything is pretty rough here and you're going to have to fight for survival by working your way up. Which then brings us to the progression side of things. So, progression is at once very similar to the original and different at the same time. So, the basics remain the same. You're going to level up as you kill things and complete quests, and you're mostly going to want to stick to quests at first and try to stay where the people are so you don't immediately die to wildlife, but as you level up, you gain health and you gain learning points. 10 per level. 12 health per level, but 10 learning points per level. You can spend those learning points alongside the currency of the colony, which is ore, to make yourself stronger. This is done by increasing attributes or learning skills from trainers. Now, increasing attributes is strength, dexterity, and mana. So strength and dexterity will allow you to equip different kinds of weapons, and it scales with a few other things as well. But more or less what you would expect. Mana being the exception, mana just increases your mana pool and allows you to cast more spells. Early game, this basically means runes and scrolls, and then later on you can join the fire mages or the water mages and become more of a proper mage, but there is some magic available early on. I just wouldn't rely on that purely at first. But in addition to your attributes, you can increase skills. This is how you're basically going to learn to do things and wield a weapon properly. So probably one of the first things you want to do is pick a weapon to get good with in terms of training, because as I mentioned, this will affect the way your character physically swings a weapon. It's going to allow you to do combos, perform finishers if you get to the higher tier, which is to say the second tier. And that in combination with getting armor from eventually signing up with one of the camps, they will then give you armor, which leads into the other bit of progression section I want to talk about, because one of the systems that has changed here quite a bit actually is the way they handle armor. So in the original, armor was a relatively linear progression based on which camp you joined. There were some minor variations between each set, but for the most part, the set you got from ranking up with your guild or whatever was just better than what you had previously, and so it was linear. That is different here because they've added an armor mod system. When you join up with a camp, or when you rank up, etc., and really your first goal in terms of like chapter 1 is signing up with one of the 3 camps. These camps still give you armor when you do that, however, it's super basic armor. It's more like a template that you're going to add on to. And so that basic set can then be taken to like the blacksmith or whatever for that particular faction, who can then improve that armor by adding on mods. These mods are where you're going to get most of the armor stats that you would have gotten normally. However, they also allow that armor to go much farther than it would have originally, while also allowing you to customize the specifics and the look. Now this changes a couple of things actually. For starters, this means that armor is no longer as linear as it was in the original game, but it also means that it's possible to overinvest in early armor and then have it carry forward for longer. But it does appear that while it is more expensive to upgrade the later armor that you get, that armor winds up being better for you overall, like in terms of protection still, which is interesting in the sense that you may well have to be a little judicious about how much you are upgrading that armor as you move into this. So I think it'll be curious to see how that plays out over the course of the rest of the game, because when you get towards your final armor sets, I'm curious, because they're not necessarily faction related, how upgrading those is going to work, or if that's just like a blanket piece of armor that's better than everything you've gotten previously, or what the deal there is. But even in the early game, it definitely functions a bit differently than previous iterations, let's say. Now, as I mentioned, you can eventually join the fire or the water mages. Doing so allows you to be taught different magic circles, and magic circles allows you to use more and more advanced magic as well. So that is a form of progression, but only really comes up if you join the mages specifically. Everyone can use like a base tier of magic with the basic runestones and scrolls and stuff, so you'll still have access to those things, but the mages actually specialize in it and get much better stuff as a result, and they get their own armor as well. But let's talk about gameplay. So, while they have certainly taken it to new heights, what's interesting about the gameplay and world of the Valley of the Mines here is that more of this is actually native to the original version of the game than you would probably expect. Despite releasing in 2000, Gothic was a game that I think really was ahead of its time, especially in like a simulated sandbox type of way, because it came out a couple years before Morrowind, where that kind of thing started to really take off, and it already had a lot of the systems you would be familiar with. And yet, this game takes that a little bit farther by advancing some of those systems. So for instance, there's an economy system here now. Selling the same item to vendors over and over again will actually reduce its value. They'll be willing to give you less the more of something they have. As you go away and time moves away, their inventory stabilizes. They regain ore to use as currency by buying up the basics of what they have available in terms of the things they're supposed to be stocking, that kind of thing. And there's a sort of just local economy system in there now. They've taken schedules even farther, dispositions, and things like that have made this feel even more like that sandbox situation than the original did. And while a lot of this, again, was actually present in that first game as well, they've really kind of, again, just taken it to new heights here that have been fun to mess around with. But that's hardly the only new thing. We know that they've added new content. That's actually one of the things that's making me go a little more slowly than I would normally with this kind of thing, because I've been specifically looking for all of the new stuff. Some of it's pretty big, and some of it's just small tweaks to quests to make them flow a little better, or simply adapt to what this remake has on offer. I don't want to spoil too much, but like for instance, one of the early boss fights against the Minecrawler Queen is a very different experience this time around. But really, Gothic, I think, is a game that really shines in the details of this exploration. Like, for instance, early on, you can find scrolls that will allow you to transform into various animals, which can give you alternate routes of exploration that you may not expect. It's going to allow you to navigate the map in different ways, or at least as far as your skills will take you. As you go somewhere you're not supposed to, you'll probably get one-tapped by a stronger enemy. But speaking of your skills, probably worth a mention that because wildlife is so dangerous at the beginning of the game, you're going to want to stick to roads and follow people around. And the nice thing this game does is that they will usually have an NPC that will take you to the dangerous place you need to go by assisting you by traveling through the wilds. On top of that, it looks like they added a few extra situations where an NPC will guide you somewhere that I don't at least remember them doing that previously, for various little quests here and there, if only to show you the way until you learn the layout of the colony. Now later on, about to the place where I'm in the story now, you will start getting rune stones that allow you to fast travel eventually, so you don't have to hoof it on foot everywhere forever, but you do have to explore and get a good feel for things before you get to the fast travel, but the fast travel is there and was in the original. Another great thing Gothic had going for it, even the original version, was the atmosphere. And I think they've really nailed that. For starters, depending on where you're at in the game, based on like the night sky and what's visible, nighttime is dangerous because you are straight up just not going to be able to see unless you have a torch with you. It's also typically a little more dangerous in terms of enemies. So nighttime is a time you need to be very careful. Normally you can sleep through this. I've intentionally not been doing that because there's an achievement for going through the game by not sleeping, which has been fun for me. But normally you can sleep through the night, which is an opportunity to rest and of course wait until morning and then move the day along, especially for quests that require you to be somewhere at a specific time. But at least for me, they've certainly done a great job of recapturing a lot of that atmosphere, which I think goes a little bit farther with the new systems and things they've layered on top, in part enemy respawning. So in the original game, when you killed enemies per chapter, they did not respawn. They would spawn new monsters when the chapters would roll over. So you would go from like chapter 1 to chapter 2, and then new monsters would repopulate a little bit. Here, it looks like, from what I can tell, and to be clear, this is just going off my own observation, so it's possible I'm not seeing the whole picture as of yet. But from what I have seen so far, it looks like when you move through an area, say in chapter 1, and you kill most of everything there, if you come back a couple days later in-game time, it will respawn like 1 or 2 enemies here and there, but not nearly to the density that they were before. And I think that is in addition to the respawns on the chapter rollover, because when chapters roll over, I have noticed that there are certainly more enemies walking around again. So I do think they've adjusted the rates of enemy respawns slightly. Now that's important because of the way this game handles experience. So you obviously get experience from killing these things, and especially in the later parts of the game, some of these enemies can give quite a bit of experience, and being able to just sort of grind them is obviously going to affect things, but given things like the difficulty options, etc., I don't think that's going to matter too much, and again, this is just from my own observations, so there may be a little more to it that I'm just not seeing. However, to talk about combat a little bit before we start wrapping this up, combat is relatively basic, but again, it is a little more player skill based than the original was. And there's a couple of things worth noting. For starters, it is possible to sneak up on humans. This can be useful for doing things like pickpocketing and other stuff, but it's also a good way to get the drop on them before combat starts if you can manage it, though it is difficult. Now, what you cannot sneak up on really is monsters. This is because monsters don't rely on vision to see you. They rely on smell. Basically, if you are within a radius of a monster and it hasn't seen you yet, it will start investigating your smell and the sort of general area, and this means they will more than likely find you sooner or later, which means monsters tend to be a little more dangerous. However, this time around it does appear you can do things like block monster attacks, which is a subtle tweak from the original again. However, the core of it is still the same. Based on your training with the type of weapon you are using and based on your skills with that weapon, you can of course use it in combat, and this can go from like really slow basic strikes if you're untrained, but then when you get trained you can perform combos, and then when you get master you can perform finishers and do really fast combos based on the timing of your weapon. So if at the end of a swing you follow up with the alternate attack, then it of course kind of combos in and you can chain those together to deal more damage. That is in addition to using things like bows. You can be trained with those to draw much more quickly. Later on, you get access to things like two-handed weapons or potentially even crossbows, etc. to mix it up. And then there's magic. Early on, there's a quest you can do that will get you access to a couple of rune stones that will allow you to use magic straight away. Even though the good stuff comes later when you join up with the mages, magic is accessible towards the beginning. It's just not something you'll probably be fully relying on for a little while. But then you factor in things like scrolls, etc., and combat, in my opinion at least, is usually more about either being just simply pass the challenge of the thing you are doing, that is to say your just basic melee strikes or whatever are more than sufficient to just destroy the enemies you're fighting, or coming up with creative solutions in the moment. It is certainly possible, thanks to things like cheese methods, etc., to find a vantage point enemies cannot reach you from, or set up like a little trap for them, that kind of thing, to lure them into a place where you can more easily dispatch them, like this lurker in a cave I found that just wouldn't walk over to this one section, so I could just hit it repeatedly with arrows, that kind of thing. And in a place as unfair as the Valley of Mines, I think that's perfectly acceptable. Now, against humanoid enemies, it is possible to do things like parry and riposte as well, which adds, again, a more player skill-focused situation, which I think honestly justifies the difficulties, as I mentioned, a little more succinctly than the preview showed off. But as far as this impressions, that's kind of where I want to start wrapping this one up, and I will save the rest of it for the formal review. But for right now, this is going great. I'm having a ton of fun playing through this. I'm kind of taking my time with it, just trying to make sure I don't miss anything new. And I think going from this to the full review, the one thing I'm especially curious about is how changes like what they've done to the armor and the mod system there, and how that affects overall progression and how that feels, is what I'm going to be paying close attention to, because I think there's an opportunity there for like over-investing in early armor and then not having the money or the resources to easily invest in the later armor sets you get, which should theoretically be better, but that may or may not be irrelevant if the final armor sets you get towards the end of the game as part of the story are just so much better that it's just, again, irrelevant. So I just kind of want to know how stuff like that feels, and that's what I'm looking forward to as I go to fully review the game. But for right now, I think that's pretty much going to do it. Again, I'm having a blast. I have stayed up way too late both of the days I've already been playing this, just to play more of it and kind of get lost in the world a little bit, and I think that's a great sign. So hopefully that helps you out on launch day here, and the review will be coming whenever it's done. So in the meantime, certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.